Now that we've gotten a good grasp on how cameras work, we need to talk a little bit about what actually is affected by cameras, what works with them, so that we can know when it would be smart to actually use one. So let's just start by making a camera, and we'll stick with the 50mm, just the standard angle of view. A 50mm lens on a camera is basically the same field of view that we have as humans with our eyeballs. So in terms of perspective, 50mm is going to be as close to the way that we actually see the world through our eyes. And that's true for physical cameras as well as 3D cameras on a computer. So we're going to use the 50mm preset. One node is fine for now. We can always change that later if we need to. And we get this little warning from After Effects saying that camera and lights do not affect 2D layers. Select a layer and choose Layer 3D Layer from the menu. We're going to get into lights in just a little bit, but basically they're just saying, hey, there's nothing in your scene that is 3D, so this camera that you're creating, it's not going to do anything. But that's okay. So let's click OK. And now that we have our camera, we need some objects in our scene. So let's just start again by making a circle, and I'll make it nice and small, maybe 300 by 300, and turn off that stroke and make this a little bit more bearable of a color to look at. Just like that is fine. And I'll just scale this down even a little bit more. Okay, so currently this circle is 2D. So it's not going to be affected by this camera at all. By the way, I like to just keep my cameras at the top of my layer stack, just so I always know where they are. That's just my little way of organizing things. But if I grab my camera tool and I start moving things around, I'll press R to bring up the rotation and orientation. You can see that the orientation is changing, but obviously my 2D layer, which is not affected by 3D cameras, isn't changing at all. So let me undo, get back to 0. And before I turn it 3D, I just want to switch my views of my comp really quickly. We've only looked at this 2 views option, but I actually want to go to 4 views, and I'll show you why. So if I click on that, we have our active camera over here, but then at the same time we can see the top, the front, and the right views of our 3D scene all at the same time. So we can see that 3D camera in each one of these views, and I'm going to zoom out on each of them just so we can see it a little bit clearer. So I'm going to go to my Track Z camera tool and click and drag out. Press C to switch around till I get to my Track XY and just position this so that I can see the entire thing nice and clearly. So there's my camera and that's my field of view. And I'll do the same thing for the right view over here. So just zoom out nice and far so we can see the whole camera. So we're looking at that camera from the right side, we're looking at the camera from the top down, and this front view is basically the same as our active camera, there's just no perspective in it. And I realize that's a little confusing, but it'll make more sense in just a little bit. What I want to point out is that you're not seeing anything in our scene from our active camera view in any of these other views, and that's because this layer is still 2D. And my background layer is also 2D. It's just a solid layer with a gradient ramp on it. So those 2 layers are only going to show up in our active camera view where we can see 2D objects. But as soon as I enable that 3D switch on our circle, it shows up in our other views. So with that selected, it's a lot easier to see that it's right there at the origin of the world of this comp, from the top, from the front, and from the right. Being able to see all of these views at once can be really useful for animating, and we'll see that a little further into the class once we actually do start animating things. I'm just going to fit all of these to view by selecting each one and then pressing Shift ? And that just changes this to fit for each one of these views. And each one can have its own zoom level, so just make sure that you're on whichever view you want to be modifying before you start modifying those things. Now I actually have decided I want to change this to a 2-node camera, so I'm just going to come up to Layer, Camera Settings with it selected and change it to a 2-node camera. And that way I can have that point of interest locked right where that circle is and then just move my camera around it. So as I do this, you can see in all of these views at the same time exactly what's happening. From the top down, the camera's swinging around. From the front view, it's moving left and right, and from the right view, same thing, just from a 90-degree angle compared to the front view. But we can always see in the active camera view what the camera is actually seeing. So this is just a really useful way to be able to visualize exactly how your camera is moving in 3D space, as well as the layers in 3D space. Alright, let's undo that to get back to the neutral position camera. And I'm going to collapse that up and take a look at the circle for a second. So when I enabled that 3D switch, a few things happened. I'm actually going to turn this off for a second. And you see that it's now gone back down to just contents and transform. If I enable that again, we get two more options. Geometry options, which is grayed out. We'll talk about that in a bit. And the material options. But in addition to that, if I open up the transform controls, things in here have changed too. If I turn the 3D off, a lot less options are available in our transform controls. So let's just take a look at the anchor point and position first. If I turn this back on, it goes from X and Y properties to X, Y, and Z properties. Same thing for the scale. Instead of 2 dimensions, because it was a 2D layer before, we have 3 dimensions for X, Y, and Z. But right in here, we also have 4 options for rotation, basically, instead of just the single 2D rotation. And this is because in a 2D layer, we can only rotate it on that one axis. But when you enable 3D, we get the orientation, which we've already talked about, and the X, Y, and Z rotation separated out into their own dimensions. Again, I realize this is all stuff that we've covered already, but hopefully it's starting to make sense and you understand why we have access to those properties now. This 3D layer switch is pretty much available for any visual layer and even some non-visual layers. We already saw that if you create a null object, you can turn that into a 3D layer as well and use it in 3D space to control a camera or a group of objects. Adjustment layers can also be 3D. I don't usually use adjustment layers this way, but it is possible to position them in 3D space and have them behave the same way, where they're affecting everything in the layer stack below it within the area that they are visible in the comp. So this is actually a good thing to point out. You see that I pushed that adjustment layer back in 3D space on the Z axis, and my circle is still up front right here at the camera. But in my active camera view, if we just add an effect to this adjustment layer, like a glow, you'll notice that affected my circle. If I increase the intensity, I lower this threshold and just make the radius a lot bigger, it's actually affecting everything that it's covering, as if it were a 2D layer. It's just existing in that 3D space. This is kind of a weird behavior, and one reason why I typically wouldn't use an adjustment layer in 3D space, because After Effects is going to keep that layer in the position that I placed it in 3D space, but it's behaving basically like a 2D layer. If I move the camera around, it's going to move around in 3D space, but it's kind of like this weird window adding this rectangle glow over everything. And even though I pushed it further back in Z space than that circle, it's still affecting it because it's above that circle layer in the render order down here in my timeline. If I were to lower it below that circle, now it's not affecting it. This is a really strange behavior, but something you got to get used to. After Effects, even though it does work in 3D space, the layer order affects things, and sometimes that can be really weird and frustrating. So be aware of that. Let me undo. We don't need that adjustment layer. We don't need that null. Solid layers and shape layers can both be 3D. So if I had a solid in here and I made it, say, a square and just turn on that 3D switch, there we go. We've got a 3D layer and I can move it around the scene. Text layers can also be 3D. So if I typed out some text and turned on the 3D switch, I can now move that around in 3D space. I can rotate it. I can place it up here, scale it up and down, just like you'd expect. Now, there's a really interesting situation where you can actually have things that are applied to 2D layers respond to 3D cameras. There are certain effects that are 3D active or 3D enabled. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to make a new solid layer the size of my comp. And I want it to be the size of my comp because that's basically like the window for my effect to be applied to. I'll click OK. And if this solid didn't fill the comp, then it's basically cropping the effect within it. So one effect that works with 3D cameras is called ball action. So I'm going to type in ball action, and there we go. I'm going to drag that out to my solid layer. And to see this a little bit better, I'm going to switch to my one view and zoom to 100%. So what this effect does is splits up whatever you've applied it to basically into a grid made up of a bunch of spheres. So if I turn my grid spacing up a little bit, you can see them a little better. And if I turn the ball size down, there we go. You can see it nice and clearly. These are actually these kind of shaded spheres. So I'll make them about that size, and to see this a little better, I'm actually going to change the color of the layer. So let's just make it brighter and maybe green, just so it's nice and easy to see. I'll turn off my other layers in the scene. There we go. This is a 2D layer. I'm not enabling 3D, but you'll notice this little icon right here next to the effect. This is letting us know This is a 3D enabled effect. So if I switch to my 2 view, horizontal, so we can see 2 views, and then I change this view to say the custom view 1, those spheres are showing up now. So let me switch to my orbit tool and just grab here in my scene and click and drag, and you'll notice that this is actually a 3D effect. These spheres have depth to them. When I get to the side, it doesn't turn into this invisible layer with no depth to it at all, even though it is a 2D layer. And that's because this effect, ball action, is taken over the rendering of this solid layer. Remember, we made it the same size as our comp, so it's basically just like a window or a screen for this effect to render in. But since it's a 3D enabled effect, we can move around our camera and the 3D effect is going to respond as if it was rendering in actual 3D space. And you can do a lot of really cool things with this effect, like scatter these spheres out, and then we've kind of got a particle cloud, or you could twist the layer. This is actually a really great effect for making a DNA strand if that's something you ever needed to do. I could mask off some of this. I'll just double click the rectangle mask and then crop it in a little bit while holding Command or Control on a PC and just make that a little bit narrower. And now we've kind of got a DNA strand. I can zoom out a little bit and twirl around this. And you can even apply other effects to it. So if I add a 4-color gradient right here and move it at the start of the effect stack, those colors are now being applied first to the solid like that, and then I apply the CC ball action and it's coloring that effect. So that's a really fun 3D enabled effect to play around with. But remember, this is all being done on a 2D layer. If I were to enable 3D, I'm going to get a warning that says effects that use cameras or lights should be applied to 2D layers. So basically, After Effects is saying, hey, you're going to mess this up if you make it a 3D layer. If I click OK, you see that it's now rendering weird, and I move around, and it's just not going to behave the same way that I expect. And if I rotate the layer, now we're getting that point where it basically turns invisible, because in a kind of a weird roundabout way, enabling 3D on a 3D effect makes it 2D. It's a really weird thing to think about, but that's what's happening. So with those 3D enabled effects, make sure you apply them to 2D layers. Now if I turn some of my other layers back on, I want to point something out. After Effects is not truly rendering 3D geometry in 3D space with this effect. If I go back to just my single view, and I rename this ball action, I'm going to move this just below the text layer. Now, because this is a 2D layer, and the layers above and below it are 3D, watch what happens if I grab my text layer and move it over the DNA. It's rendering on top, even though the text layer is technically behind it. See, at this angle, it looks right, because this text layer is further back in Z-space than the DNA is. But if I twirl this around, the text is getting rendered on top of that layer. This is again a side effect of After Effects basically working in 2.5D, working with 2D layers in 3D space. When you have a 2D layer between other 3D layers, it completely destroys the rendering inside of After Effects. Just like with the adjustment layer, the layer order matters. Even though this effect is 3D enabled, because it's 2D, it's always going to render above whatever it is on top of in the layer stack and below the other layers that it's below in the layer stack. So if I wanted this in front of that text layer, I have to move it above it in the layer stack as well. If I move it below all of my 3D layers, it's going to render behind all of them, even though it exists in front of most of those objects. See, there's no intersection of that 3D space between the 3D effect and other 3D layers. This is something that can really trip you up if you're not aware of what's happening, so it's very important that you understand that. Any 2D layer is going to render above or below 3D layers depending on where it is in the layer stack. Alright, I'm going to reset my camera's transform controls and let's clean this scene up a little bit. I don't need the text or any of these other effects. We'll just keep that circle for now. And in the next video, we'll talk about 3D lights.